I know this is an incredibly busy time of year for everyone. Just after Thanksgiving, and for people that study Africa, there's the African Studies Association conference Thursday through Sunday in San Francisco. As Joelle said, there are multiple events with African Studies this week and next, and it's the end of the quarter. So thank you very much for being here despite all of that, and then also just because it's a really fraught period in the world, and so I know that is also something that weighs on everyone. I really want to thank Ali, Hilal, and Rula for all of the organizational work that went into bringing me here in Islamic for the Abbasi program, and then also Joelle Cabrita and Richard Roberts, and the Center for African Studies and the History Department for arranging and co-sponsoring my visit. Bruce, thank you so much for reading my book and for coming down to discuss it from Berkeley. And I have to thank Richard again, just out loud, for being the exceptional mentor that you were, and guide, and advisor. I wanted to say I hope you're proud of me as part of your silsila, or intellectual lineage at this point. And then I really have to thank Nora Barakat too, who invited me initially to come to campus for this talk. Nora was this crucially important colleague at NYU and Abu Dhabi for years. She contributed in innumerable ways to the university through her research and teaching. And then you were also just such a good friend. So thank you, and we really miss you. So I'm going to today do a kind of book talk on my book that came out in January of this year. I want to begin a little bit with how I arrived at the project, and in a way that I hope gives you some bullet points for some of the primary themes in the study of the Sahara, highlighting some of the key claims from reading parts of the book's introduction at various points, and in a way that should also give a sense of the regional historical and social contexts and broader argumentative threads based on what initially drew me to the histories the book explores. It's always really hard, of course, to talk about an entire book in 40 minutes, but I'm going to try to give this overview with some specific examples. I'll also put up some slides so that you can have some visual hooks to use when talking to connect with historical and cultural contexts of the region, as well as some of the central scholarship that I relied on. And I'll give brief summaries of the chapters with a kind of long overview of the claims I'm making throughout. So as Richard said at the beginning, my interest in African history as a field and as a discipline, and specifically in the Islamic Republic of Mauritania, began after I spent 2.5 years in Mauritania as a Peace Corps volunteer in the early 2000s. I lived in a small but historically important village in the Mauritanian Sahara, a village that was known for its long involvement in the trans-Saharan trade and as a center of Islamic knowledge production and dispersion. And I taught here at the village high school, and I wasn't a researcher at the time, so I spent a lot of time drinking tea with my Mauritanian students, my fellow teachers, and then people that became friends. I ended up going to UCLA, as Richard said, for a master's in African studies, where I wrote about how the French colonial state attempted to co-opt structures of Islamic education in Mauritania. And I presented that at a conference that Bruce organized in 2008 in Dakar, which is where we initially had met. And then I began a doctorate in history here at Stanford, where I wanted to focus on something entirely different. And I really wanted to avoid the subject, which I think still dominates the very little media coverage of Mauritania in the West, and this is the very late national abolition of slavery in 1981, and the persistence of forms of social and economic dependency that persist in a post-slavery context. But I wasn't sure what I wanted to study, and so, as I'm sure some of you have done or will do, I made several summer research trips there to see what kinds of gaps in scholarship I could fill. And as you'll see, I completely failed at avoiding the subject of the history of slavery, which, while not as clear-cut as portrayed in the Western media, which is especially what I found problematic, still structures much of the region's social and cultural norms. It was during one of these summer trips while I was in neighboring Senegal, where a portion of the French colonial archives sit, that I first read about a phenomenon called sel, or selala, in the Saharan Arabic dialect of Hassaniya, that referred to the invisible extraction of life forces from a person by another. In this case from 1928, French colonial officers had been informed that 3 enslaved siblings had been killed after their master's son died of sel, and the colonial officers corresponded about how to account for these murders while being careful not to upset one of the most important tribal confederations to whom the son and his father belonged. And I mentioned my time in Mauritania because during my 2.5 years there as a Peace Corps volunteer, I had never heard anyone ever mention such a phenomenon. And so I was intrigued by the multiple and complex dynamics unveiled in the French colonial administrative discussions about what to do about this murder and how to understand the claims the family was making about their son being targeted as a victim of enslaved siblings. When I then moved up to Mauritania later that summer, I mentioned this series of letters to Mauritanian scholars. I asked about sel in taxis and in my village, and I was struck by how readily and excitedly people engaged with the story and gave me explanations and additional information about the racial dynamics of these claims, about their meanings, and about how the phenomenon persists. Almost everyone with whom I spoke insisted that sel still occurred and was only mobilized by the socially marginalized, primarily those of enslaved descent or those who occupy a slightly higher social status, craftspeople, and these are people who might traditionally work with iron, fabricate leather objects, or work as kinds of aestheticians for women. I'm gonna put this slide up twice with terminology, just so that when you hear words you can see them visually. These stories revealed the functional role of sel as an idiom that defined the nature of social relationships in the changing circumstances of colonial and post-colonial Mauritania. I continued researching sel, and I found mention in it in locally produced letters written from the Sahara to an Egyptian scholar in the 15th century, to 19th century mention in questions posed to and responses given by Saharan legal scholars, and further cases in French colonial archives from the 20th century. And I came to see that studying sel, or bloodsucking, as a way to to understand the distinct Saharan intersection of sorcery, racecraft, and slavery. The association of sel with social hierarchy reinforced the exclusion of those from low-status craftsperson, Black African, and enslaved origin, not only from positions of religious leadership in Muslim communities, but also from access to what became my larger object of study, lahjab, or what I translate as the Islamic esoteric sciences. So my book, Invoking the Invisible, takes as its central problem the difficulty that history, and I'm saying that as compared to anthropology as a discipline, has in including invisible entities or forces, such as sel, as actors of change in their narratives. A decision based on a fundamental ontological claim that such agents and forces, be they ancestor spirits, astral forces, ghosts, magic, vampires, did not really exist. At most, these unbelieved forces appear as part of belonging to a past already completed, as a belief that did or will die out once a Western form of enlightened rational modernity and technology dominates. In the historian's fundamental work of understanding why things happened, as well as when and how they did, the reconstruction process gets stuck on what might be categorized as superstitions, whose claims to effect cannot be corroborated through the usual material evidence. As with sel, once I began asking questions in oral history interviews in the colonial archives and when reading locally produced texts in Arabic, my sources were brimming with examples of extraordinary events, like rocks falling from the sky, of magic recipes to prevent enslaved people from escaping, and of invisible armies of spirits. And so I began looking for a path forward on how to use and frame this material because there was simply so much of it. So the project of my book is to build on scholarship, and I'm putting some of it here, especially what I'm first talking about is to the left, that shows the esoteric sciences have historically belonged to Islamic intellectual, scientific, and religious knowledge production. And in many of these authors, you can see it here, but they'll call them the Islamic sciences, the occult sciences, they use that terminology, and have been linked to the exercise of political power in the Muslim world, while also recognizing the essential need to draw on ethnographic approaches to investigate a topic where so much local knowledge and meaning was produced and transmitted outside of written sources. In the introduction, my book does not set out to answer the question of what is really real, but instead to accept at face value that men and women could call upon spiritual, divine, and celestial forces to further their own objectives, and it suggests a new methodological approach borrowed from anthropology's own ontological turn to write an ontological history of the Sahara, which is an expression I use to mean taking the magical, the non-human, the ephemeral seriously, instead of explaining them away with a functionalist or materialist analysis. So I'm trying to consider the work that spirits do to more accurately reflect on how people, but men and women, have managed daily and existential challenges in the Saharan and West African context of this book. And in doing so, I'm arguing that we should take into account the power of these invisible forces in people's daily lives. So I not only mention events related to divine forces, to talismanic squares, and to spirits inhabiting the empty dunes that I find in my sources, but what I try to do is to write about them within a grammar of possibility. And I found myself going back and forth between those of the ilk of the ontological turn, who were arguing for the benefit of exploring, describing, and experimenting with ontology, not as a claim, again, about what exists or what there is, but as a kind of theory or model to make space for other possibilities. Most of these scholars as anthropologists, and that here would be primarily Anand Taneja and Alireza Dusar, we're asking how to get ethnographic descriptions right. And I, as a historian, really wanted to argue that we weren't getting history right without including stories, events, and explanations that involved the invisible on a basic level, because again, in my context, there were so many sources that included them. So that seemed valuable and worth considering to me as I was trying to make sense of my own material in new ways. And then the other work I've put here is all by historians who include spirits, other invisible forces in other ways, not always in the way that I am, but I found their work really helpful. So what this does for me is that being attentive to, asking questions about, and listening and looking for these agents has simply revealed a whole host of problems and challenges that might otherwise be absent or ignored. So I understand the esoteric sciences, be they Islamic or not, as a set of tools Saharans use to shape their own worlds. Famine and drought, the fraught nature of being an unmarried or a childless woman, illness, pregnancy, enslavement, colonization, being left for someone else, these existential and material questions and problems were brought to the fore through this work. Focusing on the otherwise invisible has been a means for me to see how people not only understood their world, but how they sought to manage its challenges and its options. And I use this photograph in the book, but I put it up here and I'll talk about it a little bit later, but you can see here this term lahjab that I use, and I'll go into it more, but is specifically referring to these leather amulets that these warriors are wearing in this picture. And so you can see that they chose, presumably, to wear them partly for this colonial era photograph, showing how protected that they were. So I use the expression the Islamic esoteric sciences as a translation of a term used locally to refer to a range of systematic knowledge and techniques elaborated on and used by Muslims to both get closer to God and to enact change in the material world by activating the spiritual realm. In Mauritania, these sciences and their experts have been a part of a framework of therapeutic and protective practice attending to physical insecurity, social anxiety, and personal desires. Unwed women sought out the expertise of these Muslim spiritual mediators to ensure a timely marriage. Once married, they came to these specialists asking for numerological squares filled with references to and verses from the Quran that would guarantee fertility and their husband's loyalty. Warriors and emirs rewarded these specialists with herds of animals and promises of exemption from taxes, usually paid for protection from raids. And families with a suddenly ill child summoned these spiritual mediators to diagnose and heal illnesses caused by malevolent spirits or jealous neighbors understood to harm through the evil These powerful sciences constituted a system of knowledge in response to the needs of its consumers, most often ensuring the health and welfare of local populations. Spiritual mediators invoke these divine forces also in retribution for social wrongs, but less frequently. The esoteric knowledge known locally as lahjab could then be used both productively and destructively according to circumstance. In the region I broadly call the Saharan West, and this is as opposed to the disputed territory of the Western Sahara, and at least since the mid-19th century, the term lahjab has been used to identify the knowledge required to make amulets. And again, this is the kind of symbol par excellence of the term, containing slips of paper with inscriptions from the Quran and numerological squares to work for and with spirits and to service clients as a spiritual mediator. The term lahjab itself comes from the Arabic root hajaba, which connotes veiling, hiding, or concealing. And often when I would tell people what I was researching in Mauritania and I would say lahjab, they immediately would think I was talking about el-hijab, a veil that women would wear, and they didn't show much interest in the topic. You know, I think they thought, here's a Western woman coming to study why women veil. But when I would say, no, and I would explain with other terminology, lahjab, so ulum al-batin, sir al-harf, they would really light up and get really excited because they weren't expecting someone to work on that, but also to know this local use of the terminology. Lahjab, as the term is used today, takes place in private spaces where clients orally solicit the help of experts skilled in these sciences. And these experts themselves are known in the singular as hijab. In contemporary Mauritania, lahjab functions as an umbrella term for techniques of spiritual mediation, which also reflect the very local. Only referenced in the local Arabic dialect of Hassaniya, these sciences include the use of string to diagnose exposure to the effects of the evil eye, nadar, divination relying on sand, cowrie shells, or camel excrement, which is known as lixana, and the summoning of spirits to find lost things in Ville. So my point there is to really point how lahjab is this umbrella term, but within that you have a whole series of very specific techniques aimed at doing very specific things. And I also just quickly want to bring up the issue, we can talk more about that, but about ethics in all of this. Here I've put up an image of very eminent French anthropologist Alain Apollon. I went to a seminar that he ran in 2018 in Paris, and he has hired and sometimes himself collected amulets that have been discarded in Senegal and thrown into the trash, and he's hired Senegalese research assistants to go into trash heaps and trash dumps and find these amulets. So he has hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of them. He also has these tunics that have talismanic squares on them, and he will bring them out as he did here. You can see I don't want to say he threw them on the table, but they're sort of, tossed there. And so, and he has opened a lot of them up, which is something that most people in West Africa would say should not be done. He also says that he has tried to return them to Senegal and has offered to give them to an ethnographic museum in Dakar. And the museum said, we don't want all of those. It's too dangerous to have them in one place. These are so powerful. This would just cause problems for us. And so he talks about being in this strange place of owning, or the museum in Paris owns them, I guess now, but having all of these amulets and not knowing what to do with them because no one else will accept them because they're seen as so dangerous. So that, he is someone where you can go and sort of look at the material evidence, and he's done a lot of that material analysis of these amulets. But I think one can think critically about sort of the ethics of opening them up when that's specifically what one is not supposed to do. And then I also just thought I could bring in an example, something that only unfortunately came to me after I had already submitted all of my copy edits to Cambridge. But I guess this is the thing with research, that there is always more to do. But there was this letter that was posted in September of last year by an online Mauritanian newspaper. And it's something that I wish I would have had for my chapter on colonialism. And what it says broadly is that it's from Commanding Officer Monsieur Miller or Muller. I'm not totally sure what his name is because I haven't been able to identify him. But to Sheikh Mohammed Mahfouz, he says, I'm letting you know that I heard from Sayyid Mohammed ibn al-Bakay, or that he asked you to do a hijab so that he would find his lost camel. When you did this hijab for him, he found his camel. Sayyid Muhammad mentioned your spiritual abilities, and here he also calls them baraka, because my camel is lost. I only hope the same for my lost camel and nothing else but the granting of your blessings and pleas. And so this is interesting to me because it's a letter ostensibly written by a French commanding officer to two religious figures cited in the letter. The letter permits us to identify one of the main reasons that people would turn to the hijab, so in this case to find lost objects, a camel. And if it's true that this French colonial officer asked for a hijab to find his lost camel, it's the first time that I have seen an example of a French colonial figure who doesn't discredit the sciences of the hijab, but who on the contrary lends them some legitimacy by asking for them to be used. So, there's one question in the sort of contemporary about why the newspaper would publish a note on this document. And so that's a question that speaks, I think, to contemporary interest in the topic of the hijab. In the few sentences that the newspaper used to explain its content, it identified the subject of the request as la hijab, and then it translated in parentheses as ruqya, which is an expression increasingly used in contemporary Mauritania to refer to the Islamic esoteric sciences, but to deny any techniques condemned by Islamic reformists as illicit and blameworthy. So for Mauritanians, does this document provide proof of the kind of la hijab, or proof of the power of la hijab because even a French administrator believed in it? Or was publishing it as a kind of news story done to make fun of the military officer who lost his camel in the desert? I don't know. But again, this has been really interesting for me to find. I need to figure out how I can find out about that officer and know more about this context. But again, because this is the first time I'm seeing a French officer actually clearly ask for these services. But also the way that it was portrayed in Mauritanian media and this question of terminology really gets at two competing modes of administering the invisible that could be accessed by Saharan populations. So first were these sciences whose practitioners labeled Islamic because of their professed reliance on techniques permitted in the Quran, and second were those labeled un-Islamic and thus forbidden because of their malevolent aims or diabolical premises. For much of the region's history, Saharans located la hijab in the former category because Quranic texts formed the basis of its activating sciences, and its experts accessed its force through the knowledge of these texts. Sel, or bloodsucking on the other hand, was viewed as a tool wielded by the otherwise disempowered, who are often imagined to have inherited their evil ability to suck energy from their victims. So not only are the techniques themselves used to communicate with unseen forces, but those who master these sciences have historically situated their work within that of Sufi knowledge. A strong grasp of these Islamic esoteric sciences allows the Sufi expert to position him or herself as a mediator between the temporal and spiritual realms. Referring to Muslim spiritual mediators of the Saharan West as hijaba evokes this liminal positionality between the material and the spiritual forces shaping their co-religionists' lives, so that it's these men and women who lift and serve as the veil between the seen and the unseen. So what I argue in this book is that these debates and changes in the public roles of la hijab over the longue durée reflect shifts in understanding about well-being, religious practice, political structures, social hierarchy, and racial identity. Invoking invisible forces constituted a means for Saharan men and women to exert control over, and ideally to transform political, cultural, and social relations to their advantage. My argument is that including what has often been denied a place in academic historical writing and dismissed as irrational, exoticizing, or unverifiable plays a central role in how people in the Saharan West understood their past, their immediate challenges, and their future possibilities. So the book is divided into 3 parts with 6 content chapters and a short epilogue. Parts 1 and 2 move chronologically to disaggregate the Islamic esoteric sciences, and in that I'm trying to historicize this knowledge and these practices as they appear in the broader history of the region, from the arrival of Islam to the contemporary period in Mauritania. Chapters 1 and 2 observe contestations and responses from Muslim scholars to questions over this esoteric knowledge, questions posed by their communities in the Saharan West, and it introduces the theme of contested authority. The first 2 chapters ask who could claim the authority and the ability to invoke spiritual agents and divine blessings. And so just broadly, because I'm going to bring up a couple terms here, the Saharan West was by the 17th and 18th centuries characterized by particular Saharan Islamic culture, which included the interlacing of Sufi thought and practice, the importance of accessing invisible spiritual entities, the preponderance of nomadic and fixed Quranic schools, commercial networks linked through the trans-Saharan caravan trade, and religious knowledge being attributed primarily to a specific social group of religious scholars identified as Zwaya. And I've put the term there. I won't expand on this history here, but what I do in the book is I end up in the first chapter looking at a civil war known as Shorabuba in the late 17th century as a moment when the Zwaya, who lost the war, cement their claims of privileged access to these and all religious sciences through their near monopoly on religious knowledge. The Hassan, who are broadly defined as warrior confederations, won the war, crushing the Zwaya leader who wanted to establish a theocratic state in the southwestern region of the Sahara where it took place, which meant that they maintained temporal authority through physical force, using their swords, horses, and camels to raid and pillage Zwaya tributary and sedentary communities along the Senegal River. And yet the Zwaya were able to marshal unseen forces known as Tazubba as a kind of protective power to protect their community's interests. Tazubba hinged upon the deep spiritual knowledge mastered by the Zwaya and was mobilized when the Zwaya felt threatened or cheated. They could summon invisible armies of spirits, of God's divine powers, to protect an encampment from a Hassan raid and to kill the thieves who rode off with camels and other property. It was one of the last weapons, and the other being Islamic jurisprudence, left for the Zwaya after losing the Shorabuba War, and they exploited it as a form of spiritual violence to defend themselves against Hassan profiteering. For the Zwaya, the war was the moment they claimed the Islamic sciences, both esoteric and exoteric, as the weapons they would use to maintain a form of political and religious authority in the Sahara. Chapter 2 takes the two social groups most identified with Lahijab in contemporary Mauritania, the Kunta, a Zwaya confederation known for its trans-Saharan Sufi educational and trading networks, and the Futa, referring primarily to Pular Fulbe-speaking people from the regions of the Futa Toro along the Senegal River, and the Futa Jalan in contemporary Guinea, to examine how they maintained such reputations from the end of the 18th century during a time of heightened contestation over the Islamic esoteric sciences. By the end of the 19th century, differences in interpretation and practice of the Islamic esoteric sciences had amplified. Questions regarding which techniques were permitted within Islam and which were not were intensely debated, and this chapter looks at some of the positions articulated by Saharan and Fulbe scholars. In a region that had no overarching state until French colonial rule was established in 1899, and one can question whether the French actually controlled very much in the Sahara at that time too, ordinary people depended on these Muslim spiritual mediators to ensure security in a harsh environment and to intercede in worldly affairs. So in chapter 3, the French presence destabilized social, political, and economic norms in the Sahara, which generated further needs of support from esoteric practitioners. The chapter highlights examples of Saharan populations marshaling Lahijab in opposition to colonialism, and how French perceptions of Lahijab shaped the colonial state's responses to this opposition. The French understood that Lahijab was central to Islamic practice, but they portrayed it as naive superstition and primitive, all the while seeing it as a dangerous bridge to a politicized and rebellious Islam. They saw Lahijab as a form of resistance and a kind of gateway. I'm using the term drug, the terminology they use, a kind of speaks to that, but that it could prep Africans for the larger messaging of Islam, so they restricted the movement of its specialists and in some ways destroyed their libraries. Additionally, with colonization, Hassan authority declined, but Zwaya authority and the reliance on the hijab persisted. And so again, there was that picture of an emir with his group of friends in that earlier photo that I showed you. This is the same emir in an earlier photo, but again, you can see at the time that these pictures of the emir show them being protected by these multiple amulets that they would wear. Then chapter 4 considers how Lehjab appears in Mauritanian media platforms, from situational sketch comedies to televised talk shows to news reports and videos shared via social media. Lehjab has come under attack again in recent years from modernists who see its sciences and experts as useless, and they express skepticism toward their perceived trickery and ineffectiveness. And then also from religious reformers who see these practices as nefariously powerful but illicit. Television programming from the past decade invokes the critiques of the former group, while the Islamist reformists claim their own methods of al-ruqya are the only proper form of treating spiritual afflictions. And here I put up an image also from a program that's kind of like the American View, if I can say that, called the Tefilat, or the ladies, and they normally have 4 or 5 women, ostensibly from different social groups in Mauritania, discussing a topic. And here, this is a barnamij, a program on Lehjab. So it was often the topic of these kinds of talk shows, and then here I also discuss a debate between someone who defends the use of Lehjab and someone who says that it's illicit. And so this was common, and it still is, on television in the 2010s and today. Effectively censoring those Mauritanians who practice Lehjab, these parallel critiques have precipitated a range of linguistic displacements and transfigurations. Experts in Lehjab increasingly manipulate the form and terminology of their work. So now, instead of seeing people wear, tens of amulets, what I saw anyway is that people are instructed to hide an amulet under a veil, or they use the reformist label Ruqya Shar'iyya, which means permitted recitation of the Quran, while all the traditional content of Lehjab is maintained, including the use of magic squares based on letterism, referencing planetary movement, or investing in relationships with jinn. That modern Mauritanians do not openly display their reliance on Lehjab does not mean, or necessarily mean, that they rely less frequently on its experts and sciences. And so the chapter highlights one reformist's bold building and rebuilding after imprisonment during COVID of his practice in a highly populated area of the capital, where he treats, and it's labeled very clearly on his building, al-mas, or sel, blood-sucking, sihr, or sorcery, and ayn, or the evil eye, indicating that these remain common afflictions in contemporary Mauritania, even if he himself is critical of Lehjab and says he's employing a new technique of jinn exorcism. And then he was jailed also during COVID because he was promoting thistle pills that he brought from Saudi Arabia to cure cancer and protect from COVID-19. The book's third section breaks with this chronological trajectory entirely, and these chapters show not only how the past resonates with the present, navigating several temporal scales in each chapter, but they make the argument that engagement with the unseen is done along racial lines. Chapter 5 is where I dedicate extended analysis to blood-sucking accusations and related incidents, and the last chapter focuses on a single family whose members have long claimed expertise in the Islamic esoteric sciences and who have self-consciously generated a counter-discourse to racial thinking. Both of these chapters use Karen Field's concept of racecraft as a guiding principle. As an Africanist, Fields used this term to interrogate 2 phenomena that she says are usually considered separately: witchcraft and racecraft, which share a certain, as she says, invisible ontology that relies on biological or physical proof of their existence. And so Field says that anthropologists have endeavored to take the rationality of witchcraft seriously, while scholars in most of the social sciences have unequivocally denied the possibility of race as real, so saying it's a social construction and has no biological basis, even if for fields both witchcraft and racecraft assume that invisible forces or entities underlie and continually act upon the visible material realm of beings and events. So in the case of bloodsucking, examining these cases and their contexts permits a consideration of crucial contexts about the kinds of anxieties that troubled Saharan populations over the longer period of the 19th and 20th centuries. And invoking the invisible here through Sel alleging that a person with a certain skin color or gender or low social status has the innate ability to extract the life forces of another through unseen means is where these ontologies of race and sorcery collide head-on. In the case of the Ahel Genar, the family who's the focus of chapter 6, they have rejected the conflation of race and witchcraft. Self-fashioning as Black descendants of the Prophet and involved in transmission of Islamic knowledge, their history in what is now Mauritania and Senegal shows that Africans have long studied, mobilized, and contributed to the Islamic esoteric sciences within a thoroughly Islamic framework. The chapter relies on oral history and written records that attest to key moments when the family mobilized spirit armies, made blood gush out of the sand, and punished a Hassan Confederation leader for stealing cattle, and a more recent family feud. These stories support claims the community now makes in contemporary Mauritania that they too, as Black, non-Arabophone Mauritanians, have also inhabited the desert space for centuries and have also been involved in the transmission of Islamic knowledge. So I end the book then bringing it up to the present moment, at least in 2022, when the former president, who is now on trial for corruption, some of it involving his own spiritual mediator, has been the subject of speculation about his own reliance on the hijab, but who has also, when he was asked where all of his money came from, this is money that now he's on trial for having gathered through corruption, replied glibly, "What do I know? Maybe it came from the hijab." And so and he said that in a media article or interview. The supply and demand for the hijab are thriving in contemporary Mauritania despite the increasingly urban, literate, and connected lives that people lead. And so here I just wanted to pull up, there was an article in 2019 when it wasn't clear whether or not he was going to run for an illegal third term. There was speculation that he had this amulet, or grigri as it's said in French, on his neck that was going to ensure victory in a third term. And then this article, it writes about anonymous politicians who are seeking out the hijab for their own success. And then, most recently, things again continue to evolve. In the last 2 or 3 weeks, there have been an unfortunate series of events where women, ostensibly from Nigeria, have been accused of killing people, and that's what's mentioned here. This is one of these women who was arrested, giving them in West Africa and Mauritania, it's called a makharesh. There are these plastic pots that people use to wash their hands, or they'll take it into the bathroom to wash after they use the bathroom, that they will give you one of these makharesh and you will then die once you use it. And so that rumor has been spreading on social media. I've received a WhatsApp message about it. But what has been interesting to me has been also the subsequent analysis locally of why these women are being accused. This is a woman, and there's video footage of it. It's very sad and horrible to see. She was beaten up by a crowd, but what you see here is a Mauritanian saying a bitter truth. Being Black means your patriotism is always questioned. You aren't trusted when it comes to religion. And on top of that, your Mauritanianism is always questioned. And then here you have someone saying a Black person in popular memory is always a silal, or a bloodsucker, and it's hard to translate, but a shapeshifter, someone who can turn into a dog. So, obviously this is just horrible, and the videos are really sad to watch. I don't enjoy watching them at all. But this analysis corresponds very much with what I was arguing in one of my chapters, and it shows the continued relevance and the continued events that involve these kinds of accusations. So again, just to end and in conclusion, the book situates Saharan populations in a global history of Islam and the esoteric sciences, while arguing these populations have mobilized spiritual forces to respond to local concerns, namely the reproduction of social norms and hierarchies and physical and political insecurities. And I think it's especially in the case of these women where we see concerns about social norm and hierarchy and race and gender. While the bodies of knowledge constituting Lehijab have most likely shifted over time, like any science, what has remained constant is that Lehijab has remained a locus of concern for Muslim clerics, practitioners, and clients. And yet, despite, or perhaps as a result of centuries of contestation over its permissibility and efficacy, Lehijab endures as an effective means of confronting and understanding the shifting conditions of everyday life in the Saharan West. And I just put this up because even though I argue that people are wearing these amulets less and less, this is a very recent photograph of a goat with one of these amulets on him.
Or a shapeshifter.
Sorry?
Or a shapeshifter.
Yeah, yes, yeah, yes, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes, I think, is more or less what I was asked to do. In response to the book, and so thanks for inviting me. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I really enjoyed reading this book. It's true, we've known each other since that conference in Dakar a long time ago. So it's great to see that this come out, and I think it's a great book, and it's great to see it after this time. So I was very, very pleased to read it. This is it seems to me, a very difficult topic. A topic that I don't think, I'm not an expert in this topic, obviously, but what I do know about it is that it seems to be anyway, it's often not produced the greatest scholarship. It's a very hard nut to crack. The impenetrability of secrets and esoteric knowledge, by definition, makes this a very difficult thing to approach. I remember myself being very interested in this. One of the things that I think Jack Goody, of all people, wrote in probably the 1950s about what you would find what Arabic text you would find in a West African library, and he was referring mostly to northern Ghana, I think, would be texts that would be in the esoteric sciences, Al-Buni in particular. And so I remember going to the booksellers in Cairo when I lived in Cairo as a student and buying some. You could buy these books, some of them were published, but I never made heads or tails out of the things that were in there. It was very, very difficult for me to understand what. So this is a kind of initiated knowledge. It's not evident just by reading a text that's published and available in a market how it works. And I'm sure from what I know and what I've read in this book that it's very difficult for a researcher to come along, and people aren't necessarily opening their doors to show you what they're doing, how it works, etc. And you also mentioned, I think, that the opening of these things that you showed, this anthropologist collecting these amulets, is something that a lot of people in West Africa would not approve of. I think that there's a broader rumbling of disapproval, even of not of your work, but of kind of work in this area insofar as it is an exploration of things that were meant to be secret. And so we can see in manuscripts things that were not meant for open discussion or open reading, written several hundred years ago. The fact that modern scholars can sometimes get access to this creates some tension or some problems potentially, at least in some people's view. So I think this is really a brave work. I think the anecdote in your epilogue about somebody mocking your project description on a TikTok video or something like this kind of points to, you know, you're touching a nerve here that's brave to go after. So I think that's to your credit. What I really like about the book, in the beginning, in the first couple of chapters, in the first part, is the extent to which the book explores the issue of secrets or this protective lahjab or sorcery, these whole issues around the esoteric sciences in the pre-colonial period, right? So you really do go into a lot of detail in the first two chapters and at the beginning of the chapter on blood-sucking, situating this within an intellectual tradition. And I think that's really, I learned a lot from that. I was very intrigued by that. I made a lot of notes to myself to go back and look at some of the things that you refer to there. I think it's a real contribution to the broader field of Muslim intellectual history, Islam in Africa, etc. I don't think I quite agree, though, with how far back it goes. And this is not a criticism of you or the book, but, and I should say that I'm also doing a project that has to do with, it's questioning the antiquity of some of the earliest Arabic sources that we have for West Africa, such as the Al-Marili's responses to Askia Muhammad, and I think there's a lot more to understand about let's call it the forgery of texts, not in the present day, although there's a lot of that, but in, say, the end of the 18th, early 19th century. And we have from Mauro Nobili, for example, this really great book about one of the main chronicles from Timbuktu having been forged in the 19th century. I think there's a lot more to do in that respect. And I also wonder about this Muhammad al-Kabri book that you mentioned. I think that, anyway, to think that this would be the earliest text that we have of an Arabic written text in West Africa, and that it would be a text on secrets and sorcery, and it's called the Bustan al-Fawaid, supposedly. It seems a little bit surprising, because one of the things that your book explains really clearly is that the esoteric sciences are a high level, they represent a high level of Islamic sophistication, Islamic knowledge sophistication. They're not something which is superstitious, or it's a kind of knowledge which is developed. It's not something which we would expect to see in unsophisticated practitioners. And since we don't really have an intellectual tradition that survives until Shurguba, until the end of the 17th century, and really into the 18th and 19th century, which you do such a good job of explaining how this becomes a debate, whether or not this is legitimate or not. I just wonder if we should expect to find the esoteric sciences as they are played out in your book, in this sort of set of knowledge, set of sophisticated knowledge and initiated kinds of knowledge. We know about how the Kunta claimed mastery over this kind of knowledge in a way that you acknowledge was kind of new and innovative at the end of the 18th century. I wonder if we shouldn't think of this as something that's more modern almost, more late 18th, early 19th century, rather than something which goes back to an earlier point. Anyway, this is not a fair criticism of you or of the book. It's just an open question that I have about, it seems like an implication, right? This is a sophisticated form of Islamic knowledge. It should exist in places where that sophisticated form of Islamic knowledge is being produced and reproduced. So it's surprising to find it in places where we don't know about that tradition otherwise. In places where paper, for example, is very rare and expensive, or if it exists hardly at all. So anyway, that's just a question maybe that I was thinking as I read this. So there's two ways, it seems to me, to approach the esoteric sciences in a context like this. One is to approach it from the inside out, to approach it as text, to excavate the claims made by writers a kind of approach that we would see perhaps in Islamic studies. And one of the people that was a graduate student here in religion, Ariella Marcus Sells, has done a very nice book that was published last year on one of the groups of texts from a group called the Junta, who are also part of your story, but which is much more of a kind of textual story about what kind of knowledge and what kind of claims are made about that knowledge, and even the details of what this knowledge is. And some people have been uncomfortable with her publishing a book about the secrets that that some of these 200-year-old Junta scholars wrote in these manuscripts. The other way of approaching it is the way I think that you approach it, and that is a kind of from the outside in, right? Looking at the manifestation of this phenomenon over time in various refractions, and I think this is a historical approach to the question, and I think this is what you do, and you do quite successfully in this book. You trace the manifestations of this practice through, really, through many centuries, really, even though the focus is on the 20th century. In the introduction, you argued that the approach lets us learn something about the everyday life of people in this region. And in some ways, that points us towards the things that are kind of unextraordinary about it, right? Things are very hard to trace change over time in something which is so embedded in a kind of quotidian set of concerns. And so the way that you have approached this is to think instead about the places where controversy has emerged, where it has been contested, where it's been contested from within Islamic scholarly communities in Mauritania in the 19th century in particular, the way that it's been contested in the colonial context, and now in the post-colonial Mauritania, the way that it's been contested on TV and by lots of other people. And I think this is one of the biggest themes that comes through in this book, is that this is something which is constantly, what seems to be constantly under a kind of attack or contestation. And this contemporary reframing of the Ruqya al-Shar'iyya is a kind of, it's just the latest iteration of that, right? I would add to this, though, the way that colonial forces, or the Haratin resistance of the accusations of bloodsucking, or the al-Gunar or Ghanar protestations of that they're protesting that they're not black. I'm not quite entirely sure. They're claiming blackness, but blackness that's connected to a Sharifian descent, or that they have that they're not ruled out by being black, I guess is what you're saying. All of this seems to be part of the same kind of contestation, and it seems that you can use all of these controversies as a way of mapping what's really important in terms of the historical change in Mauritania, or in this space, over this entire period. And so I think we get something which we don't have in Mauritanian history. We don't have this kind of historical approach to intellectual history. And so I think this is a great contribution. I don't want to take too much time, because I'm sure other people would like to jump in. I would like to, though, just pose a couple of challenges, maybe, or things that, as a reader, I think a book of this caliber and strength, it deserves not just praise, but also some engagement, right? Some things that maybe it doesn't answer, and sort of just to hear you respond would be great. So you put the book up by David Gordon about hidden agents. Is that what's called, hidden agents? Invisible Agents, a book about Southern African, Zambia, I guess is where that book is based, and sort of invisible world, and he writes a series of chapters about trying to take seriously these agents. And this is the sort of ontological history that you're invoking in your discussion here, and that you invoke in your introduction, which I appreciated listening to you, because when I was reading it, I didn't quite understand the extent to which by taking seriously the unseen world, you're opening up a space for for alternative explanations for the things that you're. I'm not entirely sure, but anyway, I understand you to be taking seriously the unseen world because the subjects who you're interested in representing are doing the same thing. But I wonder if the case at the end, the case of the blood sucking, maybe even this case that you showed us at the very end, which is not in the book, but about these Nigerian women being accused of similar things. You're trying to take seriously this world, these forces, as ways that people manage, and we need to take them as true things, right? At least in the perception of people there. But then when we talk about blood sucking, you don't tell us that we should take those things seriously. You tell us that that's a consequence of the racism that's directed at the people who are accused of this. I think it's the same thing, presumably, with these Nigerian women. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about if that presents any kind of contradiction, or what you do with what would seem to be a different approach to something that makes us more uncomfortable, as opposed to something which maybe doesn't have that kind of resonance with an audience in a room like this, having to do with pregnancy or protection against certain kinds of jealousies or other sorts of things that the hijab seem to protect against. The second thing I would ask, I think you mentioned in this in a few places this question of the technology, of the kind of knowledge here. And I recently saw Daria Ogornikova, who's an anthropologist in Hamburg, who works on manuscripts written in African languages. And of course, a lot of those have this kind of material in them, lots of magical squares, lots of fawaid sort of things, lots of text like this. This is one of the most popular forms of writing in African languages. She has shown that a lot of these magic squares don't actually add up. They're not, and there's a formula, right? Usually they're supposed to add up to the same number. That number is supposed to have a certain value. Letters have certain value. I mean, there's a formula for it. But she has some of these documents and they don't actually add up to what they're supposed to add up. So it just makes me think, how seriously should we take this as knowledge? Does it matter that those add up or don't add up? And I mean, this gets to your kind of core question about taking seriously these unseen things, but it also points us towards a kind of a focus on the perception of knowledge, the charisma of these figures, the authority that this sort of knowledge builds, and whether we don't need to take that more seriously than the actual invisible forces, right? If people are making mistakes and writing all kinds of things that ultimately, I don't know, one would have to do a study which would be very difficult to carry out about how many of these squares actually add up the way they're supposed to. But it's sort of taking literally the claim, right, that we need to take this seriously. And if we take it seriously and we see that it doesn't actually add up to what it's supposed to add up to, should we really be taking it seriously? Or should we be taking instead its perception and reception more seriously? And it seems to me that the corruption, the Ponzi schemes, the thing associated with the president that you talk about at the end of the book and you mentioned here, what would you call it, the thistle pills, there's any number of kind of quackery that goes into this world of lahjab in contemporary Mauritania. So again, should we be taking that seriously, really? Or does it look to us like it's something else? And I think I'll stop there. I may have some other things to say maybe privately, but I risk to take way more time than I should. So anyway, thank you very much for this.
Sure, and thank you so much, Bruce. I mean, I guess I think, you know, just to your last two broad questions, this issue of bloodsucking, I do think is different than, well, one, it's not la hijab, but two, these are bloodsucking accusations, and I have yet to see someone that claims to have that knowledge. So I do analyze it as different, because you don't have people claiming that they are actually celeb. It's always something that is used as a weapon against someone else. And so that's why I analyze it separately and differently, and I think in a more functionalist way. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I absolutely see that as a different kind of knowledge, and I'm not claiming it's the same. And then as for Daria's work, I haven't read her more recent work on these texts. I mean, it made me think too, there's a French, you probably know him, French scholar who just graduated, Alexis Triot, who is a mathematician at the base and has started working on the history of mathematics in Mauritania. And I was on his defense committee, and it's so clear that he could bring that work to this topic, and I think it could be really fascinating. I mean, I don't know the social context of, or the identities of the people that created the text that Daria looks at, and so we don't know if those were effective mediators either. You know, maybe these were failed mediators that no one went to see because they didn't get the math right. It's hard to know. You know, again, I'm also not doing an analysis of the texts themselves for multiple reasons, but you know, like these ethical questions are at play for me. And one of the reasons I have this painting that I asked a Mauritanian artist to paint, we talked a lot, he paints portraits that I absolutely adore, and we talked about him doing a kind of stereotypical portrait of a hijab, and he decided in discussing with me and discussing the topic, he wanted to move more abstract. But I say this because I didn't feel comfortable putting a real text on the cover of my book, because I really think that is something that Muslims would not appreciate. And I know El-Buni, you mentioned, this ostensibly, but he's also someone that there's been a lot of forgery of his own work, 13th century North African scholar. But when I have shown, I mean, this is someone whose texts you can find easily in markets. There have been reprintings of his work. It's not as if these are, that showing an El-Buni text is actually opening an amulet. These are well-printed, well-circulating examples of magic squares. Putting that up in Mauritania led to gasps in a room. And so I wasn't comfortable putting that kind of text up, and so this is why I asked Salah Lo to paint something that was an approximation that those who know would recognize, but they would also recognize is filled with, in a way, nonsense. He put places that I've lived, he put dates that were important to me, and then he added his own terminology. So, you know, I think, again, I'm not doing, as you said, that inside-out study, but I think that, I mean, especially mathematicians and people who are, who are doing that work, it would be fascinating for them to not only look at the content, but then look at the perceived efficacy or the efficacy of those who are using those specific texts. You go on there.
So you want me to
That would be wonderful.
broker the exciting responses from everybody in the audience, but let me ask you a question if I can to begin with. And that is one of the conversations we've had before, Era, has to do with not only the ethical issue, but also the challenges, methodologically, that you faced in dealing with this world of secrets. What does it mean? What are the ethical issues that you have to deal with in trying to write about the world of secrets and the people who keep secrets? And when anybody wants to open up a project like this, they're going to have to confront some of the experience that you've had. So it would be useful for the audience, I think, to get a little sense of how easy it is, how difficult it is, what kinds of reservations you've had. You mentioned some of them, but it would be nice to talk a little bit more.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Richard. I mean, I think some of you have probably read Marcel Griot, this 1930s French ethnographer who talks about ripping the truth out of his informants, and people talk about the sort of violence that he must have used, symbolic or otherwise, to really to talk to West Africans when he was doing his work. And I always found the complete opposite, that when I would meet with people and talk to them about this research, it was so clear to me how little power I had, and how frustrated I often felt, because people clearly demarcated what they wanted to talk about and what they didn't want to talk about, and I respected that. But it meant I often left interviews frustrated, because I felt like there was some kind of kernel of truth that they weren't letting me get at. I talk in the epilogue about going to visit this hijab who was seen, he's now passed away, but at the initial period of my research, as the most powerful hijab in Mauritania. And I think that, to me, exemplifies this question, in that I thought I needed to be able to get into his community, to see him, to talk to him, and that I would somehow have this great story at the end. And in the end, I ended up spending 3 days in his community and feeling like I got no information whatsoever. I never saw him. And I think that what it did, though, for me, was to be able to see, and as I say in the epilogue, see this prayer economy, which is a term that Benjamin Suarez uses, but to see the economy behind this guy and to see how everything else functioned around him. And I think in the end, that was my methodology, is that if I couldn't get at certain questions or certain answers, or I couldn't get to see certain people, I tried to ask all kinds of other questions about what was happening around it. And this gets at the question of the texts too. I'm not trained in religious studies. I am not trained as a textualist, and that wasn't, for me, what was the most accessible. And so I relied much more on oral history and written documents that I could access more easily.
Questions? Rochelle, can you introduce yourself to everybody?
I'm Rachel Bautista, and thank you for your talk. So I've got just a one-part question for you. So what's so rich about your work is the way in which you encompass multiple fields. You're looking at the internal contestations within Mauritania around esoteric sciences. You're also looking at it from the kind of viewpoint in which Western scholars have debased this knowledge. And then you're also dividing this, you're bridging this divide between sub-Saharan and North Africa to talk about global Islamic culture. But yet you also do this by deliberately using the term science, and you talk about esoteric science. So my question is more about the science. So within African studies, there are scholars like Abada Dov Oseo Asari, who talks about nuclear power in post-colonial Ghana and has this idea of scientific equity, that Africa has been part of the kind of burgeoning of science. But for her, science still has this very European mold of rationality, there's evidence, there's distance, and so on. So when you use science, are you still using this idea again of rationality, or is there something different in the science that's taking place in Mauritania? And what are the conceptual or political claims you're trying to make in referring to this as science?
Thank you. I mean, I also have a colleague who Nora knows really well in Abu Dhabi, Justin Stearns, who really interrogates these questions in 16th and 17th century Morocco. I mean, I'm looking at what I see as systematized knowledge. So I'm not making arguments about rationality or not rationality, but techniques that are understood to have proven their efficacy, and a learning of that and the application of those techniques and strategies. That's why I'm using that term, but I think I could have interrogated it more. I mean, that could be a whole other part of an introduction for sure.
Yeah, introduce yourself.
Samia Arzuki, postdoc history. You started in the beginning talking about how this problematic sort of Western fixation about the late abolition of slavery in Mauritania is sort of a point that kind of came in with, if I'm not mistaken. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how this work addresses or doesn't address the point, because in my encounter with, the interest of history of Mauritania, especially the question of race, Haratin, Baydan, that this looms heavy, and I was wondering if you could speak a little about how this does help us or not help us with understanding that sort of historical fact, right?
And sorry, what is the historical fact?
Of the late abolition of slavery,
How this helps us understand
or
that?
does not.
I mean, I think Bruce Hall's work is the most helpful in this. But I mean, primarily, what this work does is to show how those histories of slavery continue to echo in Mauritania, because they it's not across the board, but it's a fact that it's harder for someone who is understood to be of enslaved origin or to have black skin to be a specialist in religious knowledge. This is changing. There are exceptions to this, but that is still the case in Mauritania. And even just among those other images, I mean, those images of the Nigerian women, I think, speak to that, because again, these are outside black women who are not seen, and probably because they're identified as Nigerian, whether they are or not, I don't know. They're not seen to be, from a region understood to be Muslim in this case, as these women are. They're seen, it's believable that they would be bloodsuckers. But there was also, just last week, a Senegalese, I don't think he's albino, but very light-skinned Senegalese, supposedly expert in the esoteric sciences, who has also been largely mocked. And these kinds of stereotypes about who or who can't claim this knowledge came out in the mocking of him. So that history is still very much there and totally shapes who can claim this knowledge. And the people the Ehel Ganar, that family that I studied, that they're claiming, I mean, I think their claim is more that even though they're black, they can still have access to this knowledge. One of the claims that people, when I said that I work with this family, people would say, well, they know Hikmah al-Kahla, and Kahla is used both for black skin color, but also just black, so black magic. So that sort of double use of black here, is still coming out of that history.
Ali? I guess Ali doesn't need an introduction.
No. Ali Ajurullah, I'm a faculty here in the history department. Thank you, this is fascinating, and I'm really forward to reading it. And one reason is that I am developing interest in the actual use of science in the Islamic world. And my question is about how do you see yourself in this intersection between African studies and Islamic studies on this book? Because, in Islamic study and Islamic studies of science, history of science, we have a new trend of, if you like, a focus on occult sciences, naturalism, all kind of things. And in this regard, so Bruce's point is very interesting, because in that literature, it seems that in the late 18th, early 19th century, there was a new revival of occult sciences, as a way kind of respond to 17th century rationalism or something. So there's something going on in that particular time period, definitely in the Ottoman world. I wonder, under the light of Bruce's question and my question, if you like Islamic studies and African studies, how do you see yourself in intersection of these two fields? Although your new project is different, and it's also fascinating, by the way, to Maoism and the left. And another question, very, very briefly, is, science, production of knowledge, all of these, on one hand, and then the craft, people who are crafting these amulets and craft people and artists. Do you see kind of a different, what kind of relationship between these two groups? Like those people who think about that, who formulate certain things, and who are somehow involved in the production of knowledge, versus those people who are crafting the objects.
Okay, maybe I'll have to ask you for a clarification on this last question, but yeah, I'll try to answer that, and if I don't, you can tell me. So on the first question, this has often been a question, especially when I was a graduate student, in two ways, and how I was going to get a job, which is always the concern as a graduate student, because both disciplinarily, because a lot of people didn't see me as a historian, because I do a lot of ethnographic work. And then the other is, where do you situate Mauritania geographically? And I know you're not specifically asking about Mauritania, but I think it also sits at this intersection, or is perceived to sit at this intersection. And I was trained very much as an Africanist here, even if I did a minor field with Joel Baden in Middle East history. And I guess, and then it's not to draw things back to the book, but another term that I do highlight in the book is one of Barzakh, and I really rely on this, and I think all of our books somehow reflect us personally too, on this idea of liminality within Islamic studies too, and see myself at that intersection in all of these ways. And just as I think the Sahara itself is this kind of Barzakh between these two normally considered separate regions. So I guess I just wonder if it's a false binary, and if I have to make a decision, on the one hand. But I have to say, even having, been on the job market since too, since I was a graduate student at NYU Abu Dhabi, it's been clear to me in one case when I applied for an African history position that the faculty were really questioning whether or not this was African history. And I guess that to me said a lot more about their conception of African history than it said about what I do, because I don't necessarily see that as problematic. But I understand what you're saying in reference to this really burgeoning field. I put up Noel Gardner, but Matthew Melvin Kushki is at the head of a lot of these studies. I mean, it is huge work. I have a workshop in Abu Dhabi. We're having 2 people from graduate students from Princeton, which I'm sure you know, Ahmed Al-Manzi, and there's someone working on the Ottoman Empire specifically. This is a burgeoning field. Islamic, they would say occult sciences or Islamic hit sciences. It is huge in Islamic studies in the Ottoman world and in the Middle East. And definitely from, I think, a different viewpoint in general than what I'm doing, but I think that someone like Ahmed Al-Mamzi is also trying to say a lot about social and cultural context. There's also Dalia El-Gabari, who you probably, she makes an argument for the vitality of these sciences, but she's still claiming by the 19th century, at least in Egypt, that there is a huge drop in their study and relevance. And I guess I would say that probably people are questioning that kind of chronology at this point. Yeah, I think it's an incredibly helpful field. And then your other question about, I guess you're saying these experts in the Islamic esoteric sciences and the craftspeople?
No, basically those people who somehow produce knowledge of this world, and those who craft objects, whether you see
Like the amulets or,
the amulets and others, whether you see a kind of different kind of sociology here, or they're the same group of people.
They're definitely not the same group of people. Specifically that comes out in the blood-sucking accusations, because while by and large it is women of enslaved origin who are accused of blood-sucking, it's not only women and it's not only people of enslaved origin. The other group of people who are accused are the iron workers or these craftspeople. And they're seen also, there are rumors that they were Jewish before and they converted, so that plays into it. But they're also seen as really, really smart, and that they are seen to have had access, especially in this terminology of being iron workers, to esoteric knowledge through their relationship with fire and spirits, because spirits, of course, came from fire in the Quran. So they're doubly seen as really dangerous, but also, again, unable to access what is seen as the permitted Islamic knowledge. But it's interesting that they're the ones crafting the leather that encapsulates the talismanic squares. So there's a reliance there, a dependency.
I'm João Cabrita from Mozambique. I'm just visiting the US and was invited to attend your session. About a decade ago, the African Union Human Rights Commission issued a statement expressing concern about slavery in Mauritania. Of course, the government denied or rejected rejected the allegation. In fact, subsequently hosted a Human Rights Commission session in Mauritania. To what extent, are you aware of that statement from the African Union Human Rights Commission? And to what extent it should be viewed against the backdrop of what you've written about?
Well, so the statement saying, what did the statement say?
I can understand the text, but it's
Yeah.
available on the internet. It expressed concern about that slavery was being practiced in Mauritania.
Okay.
They might have gone into details, which tell with you what you said, I cannot assure you that. But to what extent would the statement should be viewed against the backdrop of the practice that you have revealed?
Well, I think this is always a really difficult question because I think that when we talk about slavery, there are certain kinds of forms that might take that I think don't always exist in Mauritania. But there are many, I mean, there continue to be cases of especially young children coming forward and saying that they are working in slave-like conditions for people in Mauritania and asking to be removed from those conditions. That is a fact. And there are plenty of local anti-slavery organizations working on those issues, working to limit child labor, working to improve the conditions of people who are understood to be of enslaved origin. And the fact is that the stigma of being of enslaved origin persists. Yeah.
If may I ask another question about blood sucking? In addition to Nigeria and Mauritania, are you aware of similar practices in other West African countries, Muslim countries? Or is it also present in non-Muslim countries?
I don't want to speak for places I don't know about, but I would say that I know in neighboring countries, what I want to argue in the book is that bloodsucking itself is specific to the Sahara. But there are places, I mean, Senegal, among Wolof-speaking or Halpulaar communities in Mauritania, you'll see this in Senegal, Mali, further afield, but there are people who are understood to be flesh eaters, and the word for that in Wolof, for example, is dem, which is translated as blood from Arabic. So I think there are similar practices, and one of the hypotheses that I make is that people who might have been accused of those those abilities in the past might have been sold into slavery and might have made their way up into the Sahara with those reputations. That I can't really attest to, though.
The reason I ask this because in the 80s there was a civil war in Mozambique, and at one stage there were persistent reports of a phenomenon called blood sucking, and it happened in the province of Mozambique, which is also along the coastal area influenced by there's a Muslim presence in it.
Well, and I should have mentioned there's a very famous work about vampires in East Africa by Louise White, and so that she deals with it, and I should have mentioned her very early on in the East African Copper Belt context.
Again, any connection with the Islam along the Eastern African coast?
There could be. She does not make that claim. She makes the claim for a much more contemporary sort of. She does not look past the colonial period, but there certainly could be.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Matthew. I'm a second-year PhD student in the Department of History. That's a fascinating book. I really enjoyed reading it. I just have a question about sources. What are the major challenges you actually came across while doing research, and also your own positionality and the people you actually conducted or interviews, the people you interviewed, because this is also some sort of discourse about secrecy, just as other colleagues have actually mentioned before. So I'm just curious to know what are the major challenges that you face doing this.
Oh, thank you for the question. So my own positionality, I mean, I'm not Muslim, I'm a non-Mauritanian, non-African woman, and so that definitely, again, shaped, who I could and couldn't speak to. But I also, and I mentioned this in the book to some extent, but the very few times I did go to talk to people with maybe a translator if it came to Wolof or Halpular communities, or someone who drove me to a site and who was with me, what I saw is just how much the presence of other Mauritanians shaped the direction of the conversation, and also led to other barriers, because these issues of social hierarchy came into play, and people were very aware of the positionality of the Mauritanians that were with me and very much shaped what they did or didn't want to talk about. So I often felt frustrated by the presence of a Mauritanian with me, not because they weren't helpful or anything like that, but because it was clear to me that the conversation was again being shaped in another way or in a double way. And again, I think most people, when they initially spoke with me, probably assumed that I didn't believe in these practices. So that could shape how people might talk to me about them as well. My own, and I have to say, our own identity in the field and our life stage also affects, how people talk to you. So when I first went in 2011 working on this topic, I was that much younger and I was unmarried. And so it also opened doors for me to understand the use. I mean, I emphasized in this paper, but people always thought I was interested in the topic because I wasn't married. And so, it just showed me the importance of that issue for women. Like, that was the primary reason people thought I would be interested in this. And so, then once I was like, well, you don't have children, so you must be interested in it for that. And so, I'm just speaking, I think, to the productive ways that one's own identity can also shape what kind of information one can get.
I should mention that Ayodele is working on healing traditions among the Yoruba.
Oh, great. Nice to meet you.
We have time for one last question. Please.
Hi, I'm Gloria. I'm a fourth-year JSC at the law school, and I study marriage and marriage legislation in Southern Africa. And I'm just curious if you could speak a little bit more about the kind of the work that you think these practices are doing. So you mentioned especially about them being invisible forces, and then you talked also about race and kind of like this connection between like race as a social construct. Are you arguing that these practices work in a similar way as social constructs that then have a material impact on conditions, on the lived realities of people? I just wanted to hear more about that.
Thank you. In the case, again, I do think of bloodsucking as different, yes. I am arguing that. I'm not arguing that for lahjab, which is claimed as, as a skill by people. So I'm not claiming that's a social construction any more than I guess, we could argue about any kind of science. And in the case of therapy, medical sciences, placebos, things like that, that I think we can always question how we assess efficacy. I guess, one of the main arguments I would make about the work they do is that people continue to seek them out, and so they are perceived as efficient. And even, again, speaking about life stages, but when I was in Mauritania a month ago, and I was just talking with friends about weaning, about stopping breastfeeding, because this is something I have struggled with, and was asking my friends, well, how did you deal with this? And they told me different ways that they would rub ashes on their breasts to make their child not want to breastfeed, but they also said lots of women go see hijaba for this. And so that was another moment that I thought, oh, this is something that women struggle with here too. But this is, the work that it does is that's something that women have recourse to help them with something difficult. And so I guess that's where I see the work that it does.
Thank you very much, Erin and Drew.